Hi everyone, this is Federico with Cuttle, and welcome to today's live stream. I'm back after last week that I was working on some projects. Um, so what I have for you today, what I prepared, is a presentation about using components in Cuttle. This question came up because somebody was asking like, what are components exactly, and how do you use them, and like, are there like layers? Are they, if you're familiar with other software like Inkscape or Illustrator, then we know what does it compare to in those kind of in different things, in different kind of interfaces. And so we were thinking in Cuttle, components do a lot of jobs, and so there is not like a single way of understanding how they work. And they seem to do like different things for different people. So so we figured I would show you a bunch of different examples of how components can be used, and the idea is that I would kind of try to spark your imagination on how you could use components yourself in your workflow, how components can make your workflow a little bit easier or better, and also just to give you an understanding on how to say edit other projects, like when we do remixes on existing templates or things like that. So let's get let's get started. I have just a blank project here on the screen, where I put just this word. So I'm gonna get started by showing you what's the story with components. If you're not familiar, you'll see that here on the left-hand side, it says components, and in many cases, your first component is just the whatever default component is there. In this case, it has a name. It's usually kind of whenever you create a new project. So let me create a new project. Whenever you create a new project, you'll see that it says component A. So that's just like your first component, and that would be. I'm gonna rename this. And that would be just like your basic canvas where you start like working on your project. So I think that sometimes you don't need a component. Sometimes you can just start working here. So let's say you're like working on say like a name tag. This would be my first example. So I'm gonna start with some connected text. I'm gonna search for connected text here on the left. Then I'm gonna place it where I want it. And I'm just gonna make it like centered. And let's say I'm working on a name tag. Let's say I'm gonna put my name on it, and I wanna cut this out on some sort of frame. So I could start with like a simple rectangle. So I'm gonna place a rectangle here in the center, kind of size it so it fits my frame. So I could say like, this is an interesting one, but I kind of want to see other variations of this one. So let's say I've done a little bit of work on these. So for example, I rounded the corners on this tag. I made these fill, and I gave a fill to that. I changed the order. I added another fill to the name. And so the idea is that I kind of put a little bit of work into this one. Maybe I made a little hole over here. I'm just adding work just to show you what the, I'm going to make that white to signal that it's a hole. So I think one of the kind of first common uses is to create variations on something you've done. So the easiest thing to do, instead of like, the easiest thing to do is to go over here on this component, and if you hit on the three dots, there is one that says duplicate component. So if you duplicate it, it immediately creates another one down here. It says component B below it. And if I click on it, so I have exactly the same, but what if I want to try, give these a different color? Maybe instead of the hole here, I want it over here. And maybe I want the round corners to be even more rounded, like so I can get like a sort of pill shape. So I'm like, yeah, that looks good. What about I want to try a different variation, so I can duplicate that one, and then let's add some other features here. Let's say I want the hole on that side. So the whole idea here is that if you create a bunch of variations on the same thing, the component kind of organization helps you kind of organize them. So sometimes you want to see them all at the same time. So actually, I'm going to move myself here over to the right. So we can see this component view. So I'm going to create another component, a blank one, and then I can drag all my variations over here. So I can see them all. I can see them all together. So this is an example of using components to organize your workflow. And of course, then whenever we want to make changes to any of the variations, let's say we are like, oh, this one looks pretty good. I can go back to that one and then, say maybe I want to round the corners a little bit more or less. So whenever I make a change to that component, the instance of it that change is also reflected on the place where I use the component. So this is example number one, a way of organizing your projects by creating different variations. And you're not limited to the number of variations you can create. You can create many. Let's try example number two. That is like a sort of kind of in the organizational. I'm gonna go back to this example. So another example is very often you want to create sort of like reusable shapes or reusable motifs. I think the example that we kind of go when we try to explain components, it's often, let's say you're trying to make holes on a certain piece. So I don't know, this might be very mechanical, but I'm going to say I have like a plate. Let's say it's a 4-inch by 4-inch plate. And I want to, I want to use this plate to mount something. And so I want to use a certain screw size. So, the obvious thing you could do is to grab a circle, and let's say your screw size is going to be, a 1/4 inch, 0.25. So one way to do it is that you can like say place your hole, and then you would grab another one, then change into 1.25. I'm gonna show you the way you would do it, somewhere else to exemplify why the component would be useful. So, at 31 here, 0.25. At some point you could say, oh, I want to just duplicate this one, which is always an option. So I can duplicate that one and move it to where I want it. So these are not nicely placed, but I can try and place them better. Let's say I place them in the corners of these, just to organize myself. I'm gonna duplicate this one. So I just use that first rectangle as a guide. I'm gonna make it into a guide. So let's say, I cut this piece, and then I realized that this hole wasn't the size that I needed. I just need to make it slightly bigger. So in other programs, what you would do is I would like go hole by hole, or you would type, let's say we want it now to be 0.3 inches. So I would go hole by hole and type 0.3 inches to make that correction. So this might be super obvious to a lot of people that use components, but I think they want to make the point like super clear for those that are new. So this took a fair amount of work, but let's try the component way. So let's say I'm going to delete all these holes. So what I can do is I can create a component that is the hole itself. So I'm going to go here to the left. I'm going to create a new component by clicking on the plus. I can rename it. I'm going to call it the hole for the screw. Then I know that that hole is going to be, another circle. And I decided that it's going to be 0.3 inches. So, and I actually even wanted to give it a color. So now, when I go back to my plate, I didn't want to move it. What I can do is drag that hole for the screw here onto the plate. So I can like click here and drag it in place. So I'm kind of dragging that kind of very specific size hole with a very specific color that I decided onto the place that I want. And the way this makes life easier is not only because I only had to give it the size once and the color once. Now I just started dragging it. I can now change the size of that hole, and all of the, we can call it clones, all of those versions or instances of the hole will change. So, and here I can introduce you to another concept, which is how to edit components. So I can always go back to the component view here, and I can say, hey, now actually I want that to be purple. And then I can go check here on my thing. They all change to purple. And actually, I want it to be, 0.6 inches. And if I go check, they all change to 0.6 inches. So I think this is the example that we all kind of gravitate to, is the this sort of kind of reusable part of your design, where like if you have too many of them, by changing a single one, they all kind of update. Just to be clear, so I mentioned that there are two ways to edit the component. So one way is the way I just did it. I can go back to that component view, and here I can make my edits, and that should update all the ones that I use in context. But there is a way to edit in context, which is kind of cool. And this is how it works. Let's say you have all your holes here where you want them on your plate. But you actually want to see how they work on the design, with the overall design. Let's say I kind of round the corners here just for the example. So let's say you rounded the corners to where you want them, but you might want to place, make these to match it. So you can double click on the component. If I double click on that, you'll see that there is like a focus view, like there's like a spotlight kind of onto the component. And whenever I make changes here, I'm just going to do it like this. Those changes should affect all the instances of the component, or all the instances of that hole. And we can see, we can see it here on the preview. So I use that kind of round the corner example because sometimes I kind of want to match it a little bit to that, so I can see it in context here. So that's how we can edit components. So we covered two examples so far: exploring a design variation, using using a kind of repeatable motif or repeatable thing. And here I can tell you that everything that's here on the left-hand side, all these shapes, are kind of they're components in themselves. So when you create things for yourself, you're kind of creating versions of what Cuttle has. So in the same way, I can drag that hole I created onto my design. It's quite similar to the way I would drag a rectangle onto my design. So you're sort of creating sort of custom versions of the things that already exist. Or sometimes you can create things that don't exist over here, and you can use them yourself. I actually created an example here that I like to play with sometimes. There's this kind of old toy, I guess it's a toy teaching tool that people used to use called pattern blocks, and they are like a set of shapes where all the sides are the same length, so you can like match them. And so check this out. Like I just did it real quick here. I mean, I have the example here, so you can see here on the left-hand side, I have hexagon, triangle, rhombus. I can make them bigger. An arrow, rhombus, half hexagon, and a square. And so the way these pattern blocks work is I'm going to create another component that is kind of like another canvas. I can drag those pattern shapes onto my canvas, and then I can kind of play with them. So I can bring a triangle in, and as you can see, the sides are the same length. So I can bring, so this is like a sort of way of creating kind of, designs or patterns with these pattern blocks, which actually I recommend. When I was teaching, I was using these a little bit to get people used to all these manipulations where when I bring a shape, I need to rotate it. So here I hold shift, so it rotates, perfectly 180 degrees. Then I grab it from the midpoint, and then I snap it to the midpoint. So this is another example of using components where like I created a number of components that are not there by default, but I'm kind of reusing them as if they were, ooh, that square is not there. Oh yeah, no, it is. I'm kind of reusing them as if they were like Lego pieces for my own amusement or for my own. So I guess, I would call this the sort of like Lego piece approach. And so here in this case, there are kind of specific shapes. Sometimes it's nice to, with these pattern blocks, it's nice to give them specific colors. Say give them a fill, and that should also, translate to all the designs that you have done. Another example, I'm gonna flood you with examples of using components to just kind of like eventually something will click. Let's try a different one. So I'm gonna create a new blank project. Another example is that, the examples I've given you so far are like single shapes, but sometimes shapes can be constructed with paths, and a component can actually be just a single path. So let's see an example. So I'm gonna use a rectangle as a sort of base. As a sort of guide for myself. Let's make it, yeah. So I'm gonna turn this into a guide. When you turn something into a guide, it's just like it doesn't turn into geometry when you export it, but it's kind of nice to have it sometimes when you're drawing things. So I'm gonna draw a single path. I'm gonna use that pen tool, and I'm gonna go from here, click, to here, to here. At this point, I can even just delete that initial rectangle. I just kind of wanted to position it where I wanted. So this is my path. Now, because the path is a component, what I want to do is use that path use that path like multiple times. So I'm gonna grab another rectangle here as a guide. I guess I use guides a lot. So I'm gonna place the path. I don't need the rectangle. I'm gonna place the path here in the center. And so I'm gonna create a shape that is based on that path. So one thing I could do is I can do, four copies of the same one. I'm just gonna rotate each one until it forms the shape. There's a faster way of doing that, but I'm just doing it. All right, so I created this kind of like funky shape that is a combination of multiple instances of that path. So what this allows me to do is that when I edit the path, once again, I can edit it here. I double click on it. If I move something here, then all of the other versions of that also moved. So this is like a fun way, a way that I enjoy for creating odd shapes. So I'm gonna edit the same path in context. So I'm gonna double click on it. And then I can move that node. So as you can see, when I move the node, all of the other versions also change. So this is like a kind of like a fun way for me to create like, interesting tilings or tessellations, for example. So, and I can add other edits to that. I can make, curvy things. So this is like an interesting way for me to add, to create interesting shapes. And if you're following me a little bit, this is I can show you here that like components can exist as kind of versions of themselves, So I've done these in other previous live streams where I've done tutorials, but I'm going like kind of very specifically here on the kind of component side of things. So for example, like I can create this sort of hierarchy here where like my first component is just the path. Maybe I should simplify it a little bit too. My second component is that path kind of like repeated 4 ways. And so that creates, say I could call that my tile. And I can actually, now I can use that tile. I can also kind of drag instances of that tile elsewhere. And so, this design I have here is kind of like a sort of like pyramid scheme of components that are going, one into the other, one into the other. And the fun thing is that like, you can always like, even here where like I have multiple copies of that same tile, I can go in and edit those specific components. So I can double click into it, then double click once more, and double click again until I get to the point where I can move it. And so all of the versions of that path that I created are also changing here in context. So pattern designers rejoice. This is like, this is not the best pattern, but this is a way in which you can like create elaborate patterns or like, kind of link one component to the other. All right, so that's the example as repeating paths. Another thing, the other thing that components allow you to do is sometimes you create certain things that you want to reuse in other projects. Let's try, no, let's go back to these. I think the whole example might be a good idea. Sometimes, for example, you create a very elaborate hole that just works for for the kind of things you do. So let's make this hole just a little bit more elaborate. Let's say sometimes you want, an additional hole here, an additional circle, but you like having like say a score line around it, but you want to cut this hole as a you want to make this particular one like so, and then you want this circle around it, and then maybe you like a use this rotational repeat just to make it kind of elaborate. Let's say you like to have this would be a sort of like decorative hole. What I mean is maybe you like to cut that hole and then you like to score those lines around it. It works for your design. Maybe it helps you attach certain screws. I can see them all here in place. And you do that across your designs. So at some point you want to kind of reuse it. You don't want to, every time you create a new design, you don't want to necessarily go through the trouble of creating all these different operations. So what you can do is like move that whole thing as a component into an entirely different design. So in order to do that, you can go to the 3 dots over here. And there is an option on the 3 dots that says copy component. So we'll copy it to the clipboard, and then you can move on to a different design, let's say this one, and you can go to edit, paste. And so that will paste the whole as a component, meaning now within this design, I can use that same whole. I guess we've discussed ways of having a sort of library of components eventually. But for now, you can create your own library of like things that you can reuse often. And of course, they're not limited to holes. They can be anything. Now let's move on to. I have still 4 minutes. Just to spark your imagination, there is another kind of like cool thing about components that I can show you here. I'm gonna go back to that whole example. If you're a programmer, there is a metaphor that is gonna, there's an analogy that is gonna be immediately understandable. If you're not a programmer, completely ignore this. Components are functions. And so you can use them the same way you would use any functions in the, you can organize your code, you can kind of create like repeatable operations, and so on. Ignore me if you're not a programmer. But maybe this like catches on to someone. So here's like a fun. Components can also be variable, and this is what I mean by that. So we were using this example where the whole, I just set the size, I kind of like hard coded the size, but the size can be turned into a parameter. Actually, let's create a new one here. So I'm going to call it like, I don't know, variable whole. So my idea is that I want the size of the whole to be linked to a parameter. So I can go here to the plus sign, and it says new parameters. I'm going to create it. That's specifically a parameter for this component, and I'm going to call it the size, and let's say it's 0.75 inches. And so now I want to make that size as the size of the whole. So I can actually place it here on the scale. I can just type size. So cool. It's working because if I change this parameter, then you can see that the size of the whole immediately updates. Let's make this one blue. And so, so far it doesn't seem like I did anything super elaborate, but check this out. Whenever I reuse that that variable whole, I can bring it in. I suppose this is confusing if I do it this way, but I'm going to delete the other ones. I can bring that variable whole, and each one of the instances of the whole can have its own size. So this one is 1 inch. This one can be 0.5. This other one can be 0.75, 0.7. And so this is kind of interesting because, or this is very interesting because it retains its wholeness. It's still a circle. It's still a blue circle, but there are certain things that can change about it, like, like the size itself. And I can have like multiple versions of it with these one property changed. So I think this is really cool, and like we make sort of extensive use of it in all the templates. I think if you're not mechanically oriented, perhaps the very clear example of these, or the one that we use constantly, is the one that is text based. So I'm going to create another text component here. Connected text, and I'm going to use, so this is essentially the same example as in like the whole size. So if I go here to the 3 dots and extract the text as a parameter, I'm going to call that the name. So I'm going to say it's my name. And so now I can rename that component name, or I don't know, variable name. Let's make it pink. So now that I created that variable name, I can actually drag kind of different versions of it. It's set as a default with my name, but I can also call it like, can give it different So the cool thing about this is that it, in the same way in which the whole can have different sizes, this name can have different text attached to it. But it's also, I mean, these are all like sort of siblings of each other, in that if I go and change specific things about it, I can change, for example, the color, then because they're all related, the color of all of them have changed. So I think this is a very, very basic introduction to components, and I hope this kind of sparks your imagination on how you can use them. There are many other ways in which they're used, and there are many other kind of subtleties about using them, which is they're fun to learn. And so if you have any questions about those, please let me know. And it's been half an hour, so thank you very much for watching. I'm gonna go ahead and end the live stream. All right, bye. I hope you have a nice day.